So Brandy Keen, co-founder and senior technical advisor at Surna. Thank you for joining me on the Vertical Farming Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
So we briefly connected at Indoor AgTech NYC.
Yeah.
Have you been to any other conferences since then?
Yeah, actually, I just left Brazilian Harvest in
Okay.
Long Beach, which was really nice. It was, uh, the AgTech conference was very focused on food, and Resilient Harvest was a similar kind of format, but it was food cultivators and the cannabis industry were kind of brought together, which was really interesting. And of course, we've got MJ Biz next week in Las
Yeah.
Vegas, which is the biggest show in the cannabis industry. So, which is always kind of overwhelming. I'm looking forward to it, but looking forward to a very long nap when we
Yeah.
get back.
I saw that you posted that on LinkedIn as well. And the nap was not related to the topic that's going to be covered at the conference, right?
No, more of the early mornings, late nights,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I'm a glutton for punishment. I do this thing where I try to make a game of how long I can stay in heels at a trade show booth, and
Yeah.
so I usually need a pedicure too.
How do those usually end up going for you in conferences and the experience you've had doing them for Cerna? Is it the traffic at the booth? Is it the connections you make from the conversations that you meet throughout the conference? And knowing that's the conference space from the podcasting side a little bit, and the couple that I've been to in the indoor farming space, it may be a combination of everything, but there's also like, the one-off hallway conversations as well. So, where's the value for you?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's really evolved over the course of our business. I would say that, early on, in the early stages of our company, and then, in the early stages of the cannabis industry, trade shows were really how you got leads. I mean, that's really
Yeah.
how you found folks, and how folks found you. And I think to a certain extent that is still true in specific markets. I think that shows like this one, and really our presence, we're a big enough company now that not many folks who are thinking of entering this space aren't aware of us, on some level. Um, but this show is, there's a lot of thought leadership. They're very, very selective about who speaks at this event and what the
Mm.
subject matter is. So I really like, to kind of pick and choose the folks that I like to hear speak at these events.
Yeah.
And then just because of the size of this one, it's a great opportunity to reconnect, with folks you haven't seen in a while, whether that be clients or partners or even coworkers now that we're also, kind of spread out.
Yeah.
Um, and then also, networking and hallway conversations, that kind of. So we kind of run the gamut
Yeah.
with shows as far as the value that they bring to us.
You've from the folks that I've spoken to, and I've started the show in 2000. I think something unique that you bring to the table is your experience in this industry. I mean, you started with hydro innovation. So, to the extent that we can wind the clock back a little bit, can you talk a little bit about the founding story, and then we'll work our way up into Cerna. But can you talk a little bit about the origin story at Hydro Innovations?
Yeah, I would love to say that this was our master plan. It wasn't. um, but so our company, Hydro Innovations, was founded in 2006. And
Okay.
my background was technical sales. I worked in the semiconductor industry, a lot of clean rooms, and a lot of consumables associated with semiconductors. And
Yeah.
my husband had a commercial construction company at the time and an automotive background.
Okay.
And we had just a little indoor hobby garden at the time. And at the time, the indoor gardening industry was not the cannabis industry, right?
Yeah.
It was indoor
Yeah.
gardening, right? And he just, you know, kind of was like, some of the ways that people are doing things specifically related to climate management is really dumb. It just seems really silly and wasteful. And he's I would say not an engineer by education, but certainly by application
Yeah.
to some extent. And he came up with a couple of product ideas, and we had some connections with the big distributors at the time, which at that time, Sunlight Supply, which is now Hawthorne and Hydro Farm, and we just kind of showed them what we had, and they were pretty interested in it. And we said, "Oh, okay, great." I was still at my job and kind of doing the office side of Hydro Innovations,
Yeah.
um, moonlighting, and then Stephen, kind of stopped taking on new construction projects and started focusing his time on getting these products manufactured. And we also built a house and had a baby that year, which I don't necessarily recommend doing all three the same year.
Yeah. Totally.
But it was, and then there was a second product and then a third product. And then, that was, now suddenly we had a company and a warehouse and employees, and that's really how it happened. We did have, I think we made a series of good decisions, and we also had a lot of lucky timing, right?
Yeah.
We happened to kind of enter the market at a time of big growth, and then happened to expand our company and kind of turn into Surna in concurrently with a huge amount of growth in the industry. And
Yeah.
and that wasn't necessarily road mapped, but we certainly took advantage of opportunities when they presented themselves.
What was the focus of Hydro in those early days? Like, what specific parts of the industry were you looking to specialize in?
So we were always focused on climate management
Okay.
and heat and humidity control.
Okay.
And that was always, so our very first product was, if and stop me if this is a little bit too granular, but way back in those days, everyone used HID reflectors for
Okay.
lighting systems,
Yeah.
and they were all air cooled. And we just designed a simple radiant barrier custom fitted overlay that went over a reflector, and we put it in a tent, and the temperature in the tent went down 4 degrees in about an hour and a half. And we went,
Mm.
that's interesting. And so we didn't have any real money. We didn't borrow any money to invest in the business at the time. And so that's when we reached out to Sunlight Supply and we said, hey, if we made this for you, could you use it? And it was custom fitted to each of their, I don't know, 50 different reflector models that they had.
Yeah.
And they said, yeah, that's kind of a cool idea. And it was great for us because all we had to invest was in the fabric. And we didn't, they packaged it, they marketed it, they did all of these things.
Mm.
So it was a great start. And then our next product was a water cooled CO2 generator.
Okay.
Which at the time everyone used CO2 burners, and they created an enormous amount of heat in the rooms that you then had to cool.
Yeah.
And so Stephen built one, and he went, I just made a tankless water heater. Right? And I was like, yeah, you actually, that's what you just made. And so what we did is we reached out to manufacturers of water heaters and said, this is what we're looking for. Do you want to build this for us? Instead of kind of reinventing the wheel and building something that people would have to spend, $2,000 for.
Yeah.
What we did instead was found we had to make them cleaner burning. We had to put in a number of safety features, a lot of things that made them suitable for indoor use, as opposed to water heaters, right?
Yeah.
But the concept was essentially the same. And that's the first product that was actually marketed under that brand.
Okay.
It was enormously helpful to a lot of folks. It was a gigantic pain in the you know what. I mean, we were obsessive about it being safe, for folks to use, which also needed a little temperament, right?
Yeah.
And so, it was a lot. It took a lot of support, a lot of phone calls, helping people, figure out how to keep it from turning itself off. So if it wasn't unhappy for some reason. Um, but then from there, then we started making heat exchangers, to help kind of boost the output of the air cooling in reflector systems, and then that led us down the path of chiller systems and chilled water, which then led us to climate systems, and by 2013 we were at that point an engineering company.
How much of it was learning like on the job, so to speak, or just, and also learning the industry that you were in? Because it seems like, coming from an engineering background, like definitely have and it sounds like your husband's definitely got the tinkering chops to just, trying things out and seeing what works, what doesn't. But then there's also an understanding of the industry that you're entering, and like all the nuances, that come with that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're right. I mean, that's really what he did is he always was willing to kind of go do something new, and it was my job to kind of hold it down while he went off adventuring into or risk taking into whatever that risk was. So I think we knew the industry well enough just from the perspective at the time that we entered it, right? It changed so dramatically over, has changed so substantially over the years. But at the time, because he was, a hobby cultivator, we knew several retail store owners, that we were, got to be pretty good friends with or close with. Like I said, we had some contacts at some of the major distributors and those folks. So I don't think we were really surprised by the industry as it existed at the time that we entered the industry. We certainly had to learn, what it was like to be on the product manufacturer side of things, right? And of course, my kind of practical mind is always, okay, what's reliability insurance, right? How are we protecting ourselves and then making sure that we're putting out products that are safe, for folks to use. And his brain was always, how do I make the next thing, right? What's the next thing that people are gonna be able to use? And mine's, how am I paying taxes? And his is, how am I paying for the next production run of something, right?
Yeah.
And so that was really kind of how it went there for a long time. When the industry changed, Colorado, Arizona, Washington, and then shortly after that, Canada, I mean, it was kind of an overnight shift, right? And we went from doing 12 light rooms to 50 light rooms, which seemed
Wow.
huge at that point in time. Obviously, that's that's cute now, but no.
Yeah.
um, but I think that we didn't have to go backwards to learn about an industry. We were in the industry and we were kind of living it as it was changing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so we just were kind of evolving right along with the industry itself, and maturing right along with, and keeping in mind too that at that time, if you had $50,000 in Colorado in 2012 to build a cultivation facility, you were pretty well funded. That was,
Yeah.
because it's not like you were getting huge investment. And now the industry has continued to mature and to evolve, and now it's, we're seeing 30 and $50 million facilities as opposed to
Yeah.
$1,000 facilities. And so we started seeing what the industry was going to need, and what they were going to need from us specifically, not just from a product standpoint, but also from an engineering and design and construction management standpoint, right? Start adding those resources.
So when did you start having the conversations with Surna, and how big had Hydro gotten up until that point?
So I can't remember the exact dates. So you'll forgive me. I can give you plus or minuses.
Yeah, that works.
I think it was 2013 is when we were acquired by or merged into Surna. And Hydro Innovations' biggest year, we only had there were 5 of us, 5 employees. We had 6 at I think our biggest.
Yeah.
We weren't making anything, right? We were buying things from factories and having things made for us. And then we had the warehouse, shipping and receiving, sales, that sort of thing. And our best year was just right at $1 million in revenue for a year.
Okay.
And then, then we went to 3 million and then to 8 million, right? And that happened just very, very quickly.
Yeah.
That was something that we learned was at that time was how difficult it is to manage growth like that, right? How many systems, when a system is dependent on you talking to the shipping and receiving guy next to you, right? That's a lot different than making sure that you have a process, right? To fulfill a set of orders. But we were still just providing products and equipment at that time, right? And then, from that through those years is when we picked up. There's no one size fits all answer to climate systems, in particular in cultivation facilities, right? Sometimes, there are 10 different ways you can do it, and none of them are wrong, right? And there's probably 100 different ways you can do it, but it really, it's you quantify the problem and then you apply the solution, right?
Yeah.
And it's really about kind of identifying what solution to apply. And so, we learned very quickly that we needed to not just sell one solution, right? That we needed to be able to provide all of the solutions that could be applied, and then have the expertise to engineer those solutions so that when they are applied, they're applied well, right?
How did your role change with the merger?
So I went, well, I went from kind of running the show to not, which was welcomed.
A sigh of relief, maybe.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm good at what I'm good at, and I'm not prideful enough, or so prideful that I can't acknowledge what I'm not good at, and which is why I feel like I tend to get more credit, frankly, than I really should have for what Surna is today, because it had very little to do with me and had everything to do with the folks who lead this company and everyone else who's here. But primarily, I was working in sales and having these conversations with owners and helping to kind of project manage also for a while until we realized that that's probably not something that one person can really do, right?
Yeah.
And my role now is I'm very, very familiar with every conceivable cultivation practice. Very, very familiar with every conceivable application of climate systems, that sort of thing. So while I do work in a sales capacity to some extent, what I really do is communicate, right, and explain, go through these systems with clients, kind of help them identify the I would say pros and cons, or everything has good things about it and bad things about it, right, when you apply them into a cultivation facility. So kind of helping them understand those in guiding them to a decision that fits their goals the best.
Yeah.
And then I participate a lot in content and blogs and white papers with our amazing marketing team.
How have you seen the industry grow or mature? Obviously, being there in Colorado on ground zero as everything was taking off, you've alluded to the fact that it's you could do a lot with a little bit of money back then because everyone just sort of getting their feet wet and figuring out, like, not necessarily wild wild west, but a little a little
Bit.
just like flying by the seat of your pants, right? And I think I remember seeing one of those Netflix documentaries about the early days, what it was like there. It looked like it was pretty crazy. So it must be interesting for you to see how I don't know if corporatized is the right word, but just how it's grown, how it's matured, the sophistication of the technologies that are now being used for cultivation. And can you talk a little bit about like how you've seen that growth over the years?
Yeah, I heard somebody refer to it as there was a period of time where the cannabis industry desperately needed some adults in the room, and I think that that's accurate in a number of ways. That doesn't mean that the folks who dived into the commercial, legal cannabis industry early on aren't absolute pioneers and didn't pave the way for what this industry is today, right? Because without
Yeah.
them, we aren't here, right? But I would say that there was very little. It was all about just, first of all, we call it anecdotal science, right? Meaning, this is what's always worked in my basement or in my, utility building or whatever it is, and therefore that's how I'm going to do it now.
Yeah.
And probably not the best way to do certain things, right? And but it was, I got to get as much as I can, as fast as I can, and whatever I got to do, right?
Yeah.
And so we saw a lot of that. We had folks pay us in cash a few times, which mm, our bank didn't like.
Yeah. Definitely Wild West
Um,
there.
yeah, that was always interesting. We are actually our first medical facility was actually in Arizona. Um,
Okay.
then and then we had Colorado, Washington, and Canada all kind of hit at one time. Um, Canada was different from from the United States just because there was investment, there was corporate dollars, kind of going into these facilities, where in the US it was just so much bootstrapping in those in those early days
Yeah.
of particularly those first few states, right? Now new states that come online, if there's any difficulty or any barriers to licensing, you generally have a pretty sophisticated group getting those licensed, right?
Yeah.
They may not be super experienced, but they're kind of business minded for the
Yeah.
most part. We still see a rush to be first to market, sometimes at the expense of wise decision making, but it's not nearly as prevalent as it was.
For the benefit of the listener who may not be familiar with Surna, how would you describe, who your ideal client is? Who are the partners that you work with, and what your current offerings are?
So Surna, what we do now is we are a supplier and service partner to commercial cultivators, whether that's in the cannabis industry or in the food industry.
Yeah.
We do everything from kind of initial real estate assessment, architectural design,
Okay.
mechanical, electrical, and plumbing design,
Yeah.
which these are the kind of the 4 permits
Yeah.
you have to get when you're contemplating building a facility like this. Very, very specialized
Yeah.
to cultivation operations. And then we provide equipment associated with their climate control in their facilities, which
Okay.
folks who aren't familiar with the industry probably their biggest capital investment and probably their most critical decision as far as maintaining climate and in cannabis in particular,
Hmm.
but also in food. We provide building automation and control systems, and then certain other, kind of parts and pieces to cultivation facilities. So we really get involved, from concept all the way through to commissioning.
And how much overlap, or how much of what you've learned, and obviously all the experience you had in your previous company and now with Surna, in terms of all aspects of that climate control? You mentioned cannabis and then also food production. Are you seeing that the experience that you had all those years with cannabis is providing you sort of that trusted advisor status when it comes to like working with companies in the food production space as well?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because somebody asked me, what brought us pivot from cannabis to food, and my answer was that there was no pivot. We've always served the indoor cultivation market,
Hmm.
and food just didn't exist at the scale that cannabis did, right? So
Yeah.
it was really just a product of the existence of a market, not of us consciously making a decision to also do this other thing, right?
Hmm.
All indoor cultivation. It's all
Yeah.
controlled environment
Yeah.
agriculture. And I would make the argument that if you can design a facility for cannabis, particularly as it relates to mechanical systems and HVAC and climate control systems, um, it's a little easier in a lot of ways with food, um, and in some ways a little harder. With leafy greens in particular, where you have a lot of multi-rack situations, and you have to deal with microclimates and those sorts of things to a greater extent than you do cannabis. But it absolutely, the inputs are different, but the overarching kind of goals and the calculations and all of those things are really the same.
When did you start to see at Cerna there was increased interest in folks from the food production side?
I would say, we have had interest in it
Yeah,
forever, right?
yeah,
And it's extremely exciting to me. I get kind of amped up about it, honestly. But probably the last 2 years is where
yeah,
we've really started to see that industry, start to really ramp up out in
yeah.
the field. Yeah.
And where are you seeing, do you see it in specific crops or specific regions or specific parts of the globe as well, like where you're seeing the most activity?
So leafy greens is still the primary, and certain herbs are still the primary crop for
Yeah,
indoor facilities, and mid or the Northeast is really kind of the epicenter in the United States for that.
yeah,
We're starting to see it, drift toward the Midwest a little bit, and I expect it to. I mean, there's some version of a CEA facility in most states at
yeah,
this point, but the density is highest in I think in the Northeast, where interestingly, there's shorter growing cycle, shorter growing season,
yeah.
right? Denser populations, that sort of thing. So it makes sense that that's where the first few would really get their feet wet.
Hmm.
But I just, like I said, I could talk about this forever. I get so excited about water resources and food deserts and
Hmm.
eliminating transportation as a barrier to getting fresh food and just there's so much about it that makes me so excited. I can't wait to see.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I mean, I didn't plan it that way, but the timing of the show, I literally was having my first interviews as COVID hit in March of 2020. So, when you talk about feeling the direct impacts of supply chain issues, food deserts, accessibility to fresh food, like everything was really front and center for everyone. It was like, you know, people were talking about it up until that point, but they were experiencing it now. And I think that's really what caused a big shift. And It's something that you alluded to. And so when you, obviously you're going to MJ BizCon, but then you were also at Indoor AgTech NYC. So do you find the nature of the conversations are different, or the concerns or the needs for folks that are in the food production space?
Yes and no. I think that in the food production space, folks are a lot more, investments are longer term,
Yeah.
right, than they
Yeah.
are in the cannabis space, meaning that, the investors in the cannabis industry are looking for a faster payback in general. I think that in the food industry, folks are a lot more open to technologies that can drive down operating costs.
Yeah.
As opposed to in the cannabis industry, they tend to be a little more, I don't want to say resistant, because that's not really the right word, but a lot more wary of changing the way they do things,
Yeah.
right? So that's part of it. And then also, that, I mean, investments are limited everywhere, right? You have X dollars and that's what you have. But investors in food facilities, I think, there's not a human on the planet who doesn't have to eat, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you have maybe a slightly different mindset from the investment side of things. I see a lot more plant scientists in food than you do in cannabis. Although, we do see more and more, degree horticulturalists and that sort of thing on the cannabis side of things too. And that's not to take away from the growers who've been cultivating cannabis for 20 years and maybe they can't, define why a certain process works the way that it does, but they've certainly perfected it, right?
Yeah.
And you have a lot of respect for folks who've been able to perfect a result, through risk taking and application too. So.
It's almost like they've honed in that their ability to grow almost from an instinctual nature, or just trial and error and just knowing what works. And it's almost like a really good chef who's got the recipe down, but
Yep.
he's not very specific in terms of the science of like the exact measurements, but he knows, just leaning on those years of experience and decades of experience, like what works and what doesn't.
Yeah. That and just being able to kind of look at a plant and know what it needs. It's always really, and one of the things that's always been really funny to me too is how much, one of the things that never gets old for cultivators, and really it's gardeners too, right? I walk around my backyard and I do the same thing, is looking at the plant and like loving on it, just like, oh, look at how beautiful it is. Oh, look, I've got a new flower. I've got it. And then, oh, it's week 9. Let's chop them down and start over, right? You die now. You die. I love you, but you're dead.
Yeah. That cycle, right?
Yeah.
Do
But
you
I've seen
find
it in those cultivators, the same like feeling I get when a daylily blooms, or or something in my backyard. Walking through this, being so excited by how your crop looks.
do you see a shift in on the cannabis side with the proliferation of these newer technologies, robotics, cameras, sensors, everything that's coming into like the food production space, and I imagine it's making its way into the cannabis space as well. Is that changing the dynamic of the types of teams you need to succeed, or the mix of experience or skill sets necessary nowadays?
It does, and it's one thing that we really sometimes in the cannabis industry struggle with, and that is the folks who know how to operate the facilities, right? You
Yeah.
have these folks who really know the gardening side or the cultivation side of things. But when it comes to sometimes we're building rocket ships, and as amazing as your head cultivator is, can't work on your rocket ship, you know,
Yeah.
and so kind of helping folks understand the systems engineers that they might need, or the folks that they need to be able to call to come help them take care of their facility. And the more technology there is, certainly, yes, the more that helps me to optimize yields and to optimize quality, and whether that be odor and terpenes and visual results on the cannabis side, or whether that means flavor or volume on the food side. Um, that also makes us more and more and more and more dependent on technology, right? And when we get into a position where the technology needs to be serviced, somebody's got to be around who knows how to do that, right?
Yeah.
And so we do find, that on the cannabis side of things in particular, um, sometimes the folks who are planning the facilities may kind of overlook that when they're you know planning for their employees or salaries or offices, those sorts of things. Where on the food side of thing, I think folks are more kind of prepared
Yeah.
that they're going to need folks with that skill set.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how the industry is maturing. You also participated in the Cannabis Sustainability Group in Denver. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, I'm kind of a more of an observing member these days. I don't join as many of the calls and as I would like to, but I was part of the original work group. And what we did is we developed the very first set of best practices for cultivators, and it was really for the city of Denver. But a lot of folks ended up kind of using that as a basis for for some of their own other regional references. It was a really cool group of folks. It was a mixture of cultivators and ancillary service providers and equipment suppliers and marketing professionals, and there was a lot of different things that the group did. But my primary role was to contribute to the authorship of the best practices for HVAC systems, and then I kind of helped to edit some of the lighting and other things that we developed that first year. That's evolved enormously, right? It has been added to and edited and changed, and as the industry continues to mature. In fact, I don't think there was even a controls section in
Mm,
that first best practices guide. And obviously controls is a huge part of the conversation. But again, back then, that wasn't a real common investment, right?
yeah.
And a lot of timers and that sort of thing. Um, but the group of folks that worked on that were so knowledgeable and so dedicated to producing something that promoted sustainability in cultivation facilities, and then also gave cultivators a real resource. I mean, it was valuable information, and I think it was the first really of its kind. I don't know of any
Hmm.
other area who really did anything like since then. Like I said, some other folks have. Um, there are a number of other groups that are working on some kind of national standards and or
Yeah.
best practices that I think are pretty great.
Given your experience in the industry, are there lessons that you could see would be applicable for folks in the food services? Just still not necessarily the early days, but definitely doesn't have the track record of everything that you've experienced in the cannabis industry. So having had that experience from early on. Can you think of anything that might be something that could be lessons learned or something to look out for or something that would be helpful for, for an industry that's a little bit more mature than where we are in vertical farming in terms of food production?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, try your hardest not to sacrifice operating expenses for time to market, right?
Mm,
I mean, everybody's trying to get it done as fast as they can, as fast as they can.
yeah.
Um, but you know, if you if you shortcut something or go, I'll deal with that later, you almost never end up dealing with it later. You
Mm,
you you almost always end up dealing with it for the life of the because of
yeah.
how difficult it is to, stop your production and go retrofit, to do something along those. Um, the other thing that I would say is there are back when we first started in the cannabis industry, cannabis cultivators did not have experienced engineering and design resources, right?
Yeah.
It was just whoever can design a building, help me get permits for this, and I'll figure it out. And now the vertical farming and food industry has this benefit, frankly, of all these folks that learned how to do this stuff in the cannabis industry,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And learn the questions to ask. And so don't overlook really experienced design help in favor of someone who maybe works in the municipality that you happen to be building in,
Yeah.
right? Because there are a lot of nuances. This is really specialized, and like I said, everything from microclimates to figuring out your actual transpiration situation, right, and everything in between. There's a lot of folks who've done a lot of it, and they can help you without having to teach someone else on your dollar. Right?
Yeah. Or starting from scratch. Yeah, that's very helpful. I noticed that the team also published a report or on the blog about why so many indoor farms fail.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if there was a couple of takeaways from that that might be helpful for this audience, because it's something that's top of mind. Obviously, as of this recording, there's the news of fifth season shutting its doors, and a couple others, there as well. And so I'm wondering, it's something that's definitely top of mind for folks. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering, as if you can speak a little bit to what, some of the things were that you covered there.
Yeah, and that's actually, I would highly recommend anybody to go out and read that blog. Courtney wrote that one. She's one of our marketing team, and I just um, but you know kind of at the very top of her list is diving into a market, just racing to get there without really understanding the market, right? Who's your customer? You know,
Yeah.
buying your product, and then how do you tailor your approach to who that customer is, right?
Hmm.
You know, do I need to go out and build a 300,000 square foot facility in a market that has 4 million consumers? Probably not, right? But do we see folks contemplating that or something along those lines? We do.
Yeah.
Um, the other was, and I kind of alluded to this earlier. One of the other points that we make is sacrificing long-term operating costs and sacrificing longevity for the sake of getting to market quickly, right? And this is a little bit different between cannabis and food. Inevitably, in a mature market, the pound price for cannabis declines, right? There are some exceptions, really, really well-regulated markets where there were, I say well, tightly regulated markets where there were high barriers to entry. But for the most part, when it's a new market in a state, you have a really high price of a product, and then it just goes down and down and down and down and down. And there are periods of time in Colorado and Washington where the cost of a wholesale pound was well below what it costs to produce that pound, right?
Wow.
And so really, looking at what you expect prices to do in a market and making sure that you can produce that product, within the confines of what that product is going to sell for. a lot different from food, right? We're not going to see lettuce prices all of a sudden just, drop by
Yeah.
80%, right? Um, but you still, you still need to have a realistic understanding of what it's going to cost you to produce, and then make investments wherever you can in minimizing those production costs. Because at the end of the day, the folks who can produce a high quality product at the lowest price are the folks who are going to, kind of survive the ebbs and flows of any market. Right?
Yeah. We'll be sure to make to have that article linked in the show notes as well, so they can read through it, because I think it's very insightful, eye-opening, and a helpful reminder that it's not all roses and rainbows in this market.
Yeah.
As much as people are really hyped up on the promise of vertical farming, you alluded to it a little bit earlier about how excited you are about what's happening in the space, and fixing the problem of food deserts. What else specifically, when you think about, the promise of what's possible, and just from your experience, where do you see the potential for growth, or the possibilities for some really interesting progress in this space?
And water resources is a big one for me, right? And we see it in commercial agriculture. I've read varying statistics, but traditional agriculture uses somewhere between 70 and 90% of the world's water resources, right?
Mm, yeah,
Um, and if you are cultivating in a completely controlled environment, your plant doesn't consume water. Your plant uses water as a delivery mechanism and then transpires that same moisture right back out into the space. So the ability to recapture and reuse water,
mm,
and eliminate runoff entirely,
yeah,
potentially. So runoff, and then the pollution into the waterways, that is associated with that runoff, eliminating that entirely in an indoor cultivation, and then recapturing and reusing water. And it's just the water cycle over and over and over. And you know that could be hugely impactful to water resources in the world, right? Especially when you start going places where water is exceptionally scarce, right?
yeah,
Or
yeah,
where droughts are an even bigger deal. Um, that's a big one for me. Poverty and the access to unprocessed foods, for children who are kind of growing up in underserved areas, right? Um, what does it mean to a child who's never had a salad? That's a true story. You probably heard it at the
oh yeah, and at the
AgTech
indoor
conference,
AgTech, yeah,
right?
that's
I mean, this
right.
kid is eating a salad for the first time in his life. I can't even wrap my mind around that.
Yeah, yeah,
Know, and what that means, for the cost of healthcare over the long term, right? I mean, that can be really meaningful. Reduction in transportation costs associated with moving food from, Mexico to Alaska, right? Why in the world are we shipping, you know,
jalapenos.
right? It just,
Yeah,
now with the understanding that there's the elephant in the room being the energy component,
of
right?
course, yeah, yeah,
That's a solvable problem.
yeah, yeah,
It really is. I mean, there are with investment in renewable energy resources and those sorts of things. So then what we've got to turn our attention to is how do we make it affordable, right?
hmm
And it's beyond. It's I know that we can make a head of lettuce that we grow 4 miles away from a grocery store. I know we can make it every bit as affordable as one that we grow 3,000 miles from that same grocery store.
yeah,
There's no way
yeah,
that we can't, right? And that's exciting. Um, they're making a lot more people, and we're running out of arable land, right? So then we get into, well, GMO is kind of a dirty word in a lot of circles. They don't like it, but in a lot of cases, we use genetic modification to make crops more suitable for their environment,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
We we want to, boost production, right? We want to make the corn cob bigger or the apple redder or whatever look better for folks. But we also want to make it, um, less susceptible to climate, anomalies, right? Less susceptible to extreme heat or cold, or we want to make it more, stand up to certain pests and that sort of thing better. What happens if we don't have to do that? Because we're controlling the environment and we're managing that climate, right? What can we do to boost output even further in a controlled environment if we really turn our attention to just doing that?
Yeah.
That's exciting. I think that there's real possibility there. And then, like I go back to climate change and the extreme waste. How much food, how many crops are just destroyed? How many farmers have to be subsidized for hailstorms and
Yeah.
floods,
Yeah.
and all of these things that and then what that does to food prices, right? We have a repeatable, sustainable. We know exactly what we're getting. We know exactly when we're getting it because we're not susceptible to the whims of Mother Nature. Then shouldn't that stabilize
Yeah.
food prices to some extent, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that we replace traditional agriculture entirely. That's never going to happen, right? It's not like this isn't the solution to a food problem, but it's certainly one of the solutions, right?
Yeah, definitely. What's a tough question you've had to ask yourself recently?
Ooh, that's a tough question. um, uh, I still, even today, as much as I love what I do, I'm also, and so that's always kind of in the back of my mind. Like, am I doing enough for my children, and am I doing enough for my work, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a tough one. That's not that you're my therapist, but
No, but it's something that anyone who's either an entrepreneur, a business owner in an industry that's rapidly growing, that asks a lot of you. That's a very valid question, and it's something that I'm sure everyone has to figure out for themselves, where that balance lies, and how much of that affects your day-to-day decisions about how deeply enmeshed and how much of yourself you want to give to this
yeah,
business, because at the end of the day, your children are going to model what they see in you, right? And they're going to see work ethic, behaviors, work-life balance, all those things, whether you realize, and I'm sure it as a parent, that they're always looking, they're always observant, they're always paying attention. Yeah.
they are, and it's interesting because I feel like I have to tell my children, I'm sorry I can't come to that event with you. I have this work thing that I have to do, right?
Yeah.
And I have to say that too much, but I also have to say more commonly that I'm comfortable with. I'm sorry I can't do that, for work because my kid has something, right?
Yeah.
And in neither case do I feel like I, like it's enough, I guess is the question. So that's the question I ask myself every week, was like, did everybody get enough of Brandy this week?
Well, I definitely appreciate you making enough of your time for this show. So just one last thought, like on the future of this industry, having been around it for a long time, to see it, from its early days on the cannabis side and then move into food production. How do you, when you look out 6 months, a year from now, like what has you excited about what's possible and the potential?
Oh man, I hope I can edit my dog out. I think
It's a reminder that as podcasters, we don't live in perfectly sterile studio environments, and so I think it adds a little bit. What's your dog's name?
that's Archer. He says hi.
Okay.
Knows how to open doors. So he likes to open my door. To 1 second. I'm gonna
Yeah, no worries.
I'll be right back. Okay.
Yeah. Levi, obviously we're going to need to edit this out. Thank you.
I am so sorry about that.
That's okay.
So, future of the industry. The two industries, controlled environment agriculture, although both crops are, indoor cultivated,
Yeah.
the cannabis industry and the food industry are they're going to follow divergent paths, right?
Yeah.
It's not the same thing. What I get excited for in the cannabis industry is the real possibilities for medical intervention. And, we still are not doing enough at the federal level to really dive into all the possibilities of the plant. And something that we didn't really talk about is my husband in 2007 had a grand mal seizure, and since 2011 has used only CBD oil to treat it, and has not had a seizure since 2011.
That's great.
And so I get very, very, very excited about all the possibilities, medically with cannabis. And now that the industry has kind of established itself and it's fairly well regulated, in most states, the possibilities are really endless. And I just can't wait, right, for the real research and the real investment that goes into what kinds of treatments we can really come up with. On the food side, like I kind of dived into it a little bit, but I think, there are some real benefits, financial benefits, economic benefits, health benefits, climate benefits, to cultivating food indoors. And I'm so excited to see the excitement from the investor side of things, and the industry kind of really getting a foothold, and the Plenties and the Caleras and the Boweries of the world, kind of showing us what's possible, right? And increasing sophistication, driving down those costs, and all the things that they're doing to to make it viable as a long-term industry.
Definitely an exciting space to be in with all the development and technology making things possible that I think, maybe even you looking back 10, 15 years ago, didn't even think that stuff like this could be possible. So I'm sure even for you to see it and to have a front row seat all these years has been something interesting to watch and then gives you hope for what's possible, in terms of what you've seen up until now and what's possible for the future.
It's been fascinating, and I really think it only gets cooler from here.
Yeah. That's a nice pun on given what you cover in the industry. Pun intended. Yeah, very appropriate. Well, Brandy, I'm glad we got to connect at Indoor AgTech, and I'm glad you were able to come on and have some time to share your story, which is very inspirational as well. I also want to highlight as many female founders or founders of color in this space, because what I noticed in the beginning is, as I started interviewing, there wasn't a lot of diversity there, and so we didn't even touch on that, what it's been like to be a female in this space. But I think it's very inspirational to hear your story, and the more I can do to highlight stories like this, I think it just makes it paints a better and broader picture of the industry, and gives people hope and inspiration for entering it as well.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that. It was a real pleasure to meet you. I'm glad we ran into each other. I appreciate you taking the time to chat. And I don't really think about the female founder component that often, but when I look around our industry, I see a lot of folks who a lot more folks who look like me
Yeah.
than I did in the semiconductor industry for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Well, we'll make sure we have links to Surna. Anywhere else you want to send folks? Surna.com. Anyone else to connect with you?
That would be great. You can find me on LinkedIn also.
Okay. All right. Appreciate you taking the time. Thank you.
Yeah.